Good morning, guys. I hope everybody had a great winter break. I hope you guys are well rested. I will be back on Thursday. My son had a really bad cold. He had a doctor's appointment today, and he cannot return to school on Thursday until Thursday. So I will be back on Thursday. So, as usual, we are going to start off with our moment in Black history, and our moment in Black history is dedicated to John Lewis, who recently had a birthday on Sunday.
Sometimes I hear people saying nothing has changed. But for someone to grow up the way I grew up in the cotton fields of Alabama, to now be serving in the United States Congress, makes me want to tell them, come and walk in my shoes.
John Lewis grew up in rural Alabama at the height of segregation and Jim Crow. And at a very early age, he understood the inequality between African Americans and white Americans in Southern society. He was inspired to do something about that. He initially wanted to become a minister. So he came to Nashville, Tennessee, as a young adult to study theology. He quickly, however, became sidetracked because he came to Nashville at the very moment when many African American and white students in that city were organizing to desegregate lunch counters and businesses in downtown movement. John Lewis quickly found his way to the members of the Nashville movement, and that redirected his entire career. That's when he signed on to become a movement activist and joined the marches and the protests there. What makes John Lewis so significant in any history of the civil rights movement is that as a result of this decision that he made in Nashville to dedicate his life to social activism, he was present at practically every major event in the civil rights era of the 60s. For example, he became involved in the Freedom Rides in 1961.
A bus was set on fire in Anniston, Alabama. We were beaten and arrested and jailed, but we helped bring an end to segregation and public transportation.
Congressman Lewis, John Lewis, was and is a very courageous man. He was willing to be arrested and to go to jail for things in which he believed, the epitome of nonviolent protest for something he thought was right, true equality and social justice.
Another action that John Lewis was involved in is the famous march in 1965 from Selma, Alabama, to the state capitol in Montgomery. Members of SNCC, along with members of the SCLC, led by Dr. King, Andrew Young, decide to march very visibly from Selma, this very small town that no one had ever heard of, to Montgomery, in order to call attention to the need to protect the voting rights of the black people and the poor people of the state of Alabama.
I happen to believe, and I truly believe this, that the vote is precious, almost sacred in a democratic society. It is the most powerful, non-violent instrument or tool that we have. We have to use it. When people come together and pool their political power, they can determine who is the mayor, who is the police chief, who is the governor, who is the congressperson, and who is the president of the United States.
John Lewis was invited to give a speech at the very important 1963 March on Washington in Washington, D.C. The March on Washington is a proud moment for John Lewis, not only because he gets to stand before the nation talking about what it means to be a member of the movement, but also because he comes on as a prelude to Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream speech.
Those who have said be patient and wait, we We must say that we cannot be patient. We do not want our freedom gradually, but we want to be free now.
What distinguishes his leadership in the movement is that John Lewis always emphasized working collaboratively with other individuals and groups and building coalitions between groups, bringing majority black groups together with majority white groups. John Lewis is a member of the House of Representatives for the state of Georgia today. And in that capacity, he continues using some of the strategies and tactics of the civil rights movement.
The time for silence and patience is long gone. We're calling on the leadership of the House to bring common sense gun control legislation to the House floor. Give us a vote.
He has carried that mantle over many, many years in the United States Congress. And he has represented his district here in Atlanta exceedingly well over time.
He's still very much devoted in his capacity as a civic leader to issues of civil rights and human rights, very much devoted to themes of tolerance and bridging difference in his work today.
Sometimes I hear people saying,
So, as I said, John Lewis would have celebrated his birthday on Sunday, February 21st. He passed away last year on July 17th. So now we're going to venture into World War II and the events that led up to Georgia, to the United States entering World War II, and the contributions that Georgia made. So on the first section of your notes, you are going to look at a gallery and you're going to list 3 adjectives that describe these images. So I'm going to click through them and I'm going to describe what the images are. Now remember, an adjective is something that describes a noun. So I could say Miss Cash has pink fingernails. Pink would be the adjective because it's describing the color of my nails. So let's take a look at some images. All right, so the first image is of German troops who were marching through Poland after they invaded the nation on September 1st, 1939. We then have Hitler speaking to Nazi party officials in 1939. You can see that he is on a raised platform. He's speaking to many of his supporters and other officials. We have Japanese troops who are occupying a strategic point on Chusan Island on July 14th during the Sino-Japanese War. Then German soldiers who are standing and viewing the Eiffel Tower. British Hawker Hurricanes flying formation. So these planes served as the first line of defense against German bombers who were attacking England. Here's smoke that is rising behind the Tower Bridge during the first mass daylight bombing of London. So one adjective could be destruction. So here's Mussolini with Hitler and other leading Nazis who were visiting Germany during the war. Here are German tanks. They're taking position. This is a view of the destruction of Pearl Harbor after the Japanese bombing. So here's another destruction, smoky, explosives. dark, gloomy. Here's an image of Roosevelt signing the declaration of war against Japan as a result of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Here are British prisoners who leave Hong Kong for a prison camp. Anti-aircraft fire glows over Algiers. Here's some black smoke rising from demolished buildings. So you can say destruction or demolished, damaged. Those are all good adjectives. So here's some British troops. So formation, urgent. Here are more Soviet soldiers. Here are German prisoners that are captured in Italy. They're on their way to a prison camp. And here are some French refugees who have sought refuge in a quarry. So their homes have been destroyed due to the war. So I want you to think of three adjectives that would describe the images that you just saw. So there were, I named, you can put dark, gloomy, dangerous, explosives, dangerous, crowds, trained. So any adjectives that come to mind as you view the images. Okay, so first we need to know the background of World War II and what causes it to initially break out. So when World War II erupts in September 1939, many Americans viewed this as a European problem. They did not want to have anything to do with what was going on in Europe, and they were hoping to stay out of this conflict. So this desire to stay out of the conflict became known as isolationism. So, as Germany, which was led by Adolf Hitler, continued to be victorious and take over nation after nation, the U.S. continued to keep a watch from the sidelines. Again, America did not want to enter the war. They viewed it as a European problem. They believed in isolationism, so they were definitely did not want to join in this war. So, meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japanese leader Toho was taking over large portions of China and other countries in Asia. So, while the U.S. continued to remain officially neutral because there was a neutrality act in place, America became increasingly worried about what was going on in both Europe and Asia. So, this concern is what ultimately led to America's involvement in the Lend-Lease Act. This was a way to help the Allied powers be victorious without actually getting involved in the war that was raging around the globe. So they felt that Roosevelt felt that if he put together this Lend-Lease Act, he would make Americans happy by providing support to Allied powers and helping them maintain control and not to be overtaken by Germany. And they could not get involved with the war. So they would be helpful without getting involved physically in the war and sending soldiers. So on the second section, you have to tell what isolation is. Isolationism is the desire and hope to stay out of the conflict. You then have to list the two goals of America's involvement in the Lend-Lease Act. Those two goals are first, to help the Allies stay victorious so that the war wouldn't move on to U.S. territory and it be taken over. And the second goal was not to get involved in the war that is raging on. So I'm going to give you about a minute to write down your answers on your handout. So about 10 seconds left. If you need more time, you can pause the video to finish jotting down your answers. All right, and we're going to move to the next portion. So here is a video on the Lend-Lease Act.
I say, old chap, could we borrow a bunch of weapons? The Jerrys are at the gate, and we surely wouldn't want them crossing the Channel into Mother England. This was the situation facing the British in the early days of World War II, which prompted the signing of the Lend-Lease Act between Great Britain and the United States. Here's how it went down. England had been fighting the Nazis since 1939, and it was running out of money to pay for the munitions it'd been buying from the United States. In December of 1940, England warned U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt that it'd soon be bankrupt. Though the U.S. was not yet involved in the war, President Roosevelt wanted to support England. However, he was bound by the Neutrality Act of 1939. This act allowed the U.S. to sell arms to countries like England, but only on what was called a cash and carry basis. Any closer assistance was prohibited. In early January of 1941, FDR asked Congress if he could do things a little differently. He wanted the power to lend and or lease weapons to American allies. The act would authorize the president to sell, lend, or rent military hardware to any country deemed vital to national security. This was the Lend-Lease Act. But not everybody was cool with the proposed legislation. Some Americans felt the act would give the president too much power, and there were plenty of isolationists in Congress who didn't want to get involved in that messy war over there in Europe. One of those isolationists was Ohio Senator Robert Taft, a Republican critic of many of Roosevelt's policies. Taft feared the act would, quote, give the president power to carry on a kind of undeclared war all over the world in which America would do everything except actually put soldiers in the front line trenches where the fighting is. Taft wasn't wrong. That's exactly what the Lend-Lease Act wanted to accomplish. Congress and the American public still weren't totally on board with going to war. So Lend-Lease was a compromise, a way to fight in World War II without actually fighting. Officially, the U.S. would still be neutral. The bill bounced around Congress for a couple of months before being signed that March. Though Lend-Lease was initially designed to aid Great Britain, it was also used to supply China in April of 41 and the Soviet Union in September. By the war's end, over 36 countries had received help from the U.S. to the tune of billions of dollars. The Lend-Lease Act was signed on March 11, 1941. Exactly 9 months later, Japan attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor, prompting the U.S. to officially enter World War II. Though it would provide foreign aid to its allies, any ambiguity about the Americans' role in the war was gone.
Okay, so you are going to use this video to complete questions in section 3 of your handout.
I say, old chap, could we borrow a bunch of...
So you have 3 questions that you have to answer. The first question, number 1, says, what prompted FDR to begin the Lend-Lease Act? So in the video, he states that England warns Roosevelt that they are soon going to be bankrupt, but FDR wants to continue providing aid to help them maintain their victory. So this leads us into question number 2. What did the Lend-Lease Act allow the U.S. to do? So this act allowed the U.S. to lend or lease weapons to American allies who were considered to be vital to national security. And question number 3, the Lend-Lease Act was considered to be a compromise. Give you about a minute to get that typed in. Well, written down on your handout. Okay, about 10 more seconds. And then we will advance to the next portion. So, fearing that a victory could be granted to Japan and Germany, the U.S. began to lend support to allies who were at war with the Japanese and the Germans. So, the U.S. Began to send billions of dollars in supplies to Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. So, in exchange for getting this money for supplies, these allied countries would give the U.S. the privilege to use their military bases in their countries if it was necessary. So the Lend-Lease Act was passed by Congress in February of 1941 and signed into law by Roosevelt in March. So for the next 4 years, the U.S. sells allied countries supplies and military equipment, and when the countries can't afford to purchase the supplies, the U.S. continues to send them anyway, and they agree to accept payment when the war is over. So this was part of the Lend-Lease Act. So the total amount of aid that was sent was $11.1 billion. So if you look at the chart, for ammunitions, we have $5.2 million. Industrial items, $2.4 million. Agricultural products, $1.6 million. Shipping, repairs, and production facilities, $1.9 million. So this is a question on your handout. What was the amount of aid as a result of the Lend-Lease Act? And it is $11.1 billion. So under the Lend-Lease Act, question number 1 says, what did the U.S. sell or offer to the Allied powers? So they sold supplies and military equipment. And in return, question number 2, the U.S. received the privilege to use military bases in those countries if it ever became necessary. So when allies could not afford to purchase supplies, the U.S. continued to send them, agreeing to accept payment when the war was over. So go ahead and fill in your answers in this section. So I'm going to do 2 minutes this time. So for question number 1, supplies and military equipment. Question number 2, the privilege to use military bases in their countries if necessary. And question number 3, they agreed to accept payment when the war was over. All right. So there was, of course, opposition to the Lend-Lease Act because some Americans worried that if the U.S. became involved at all, they would end up being dragged into the war. So opposition means to those people who were against the war. So others argued about the fact that the U.S. was often giving away supplies because remember, they agreed that if the countries could not pay for the supplies, that they could still get the supplies, but just pay the U.S. back when the war was over. So many Americans felt that the U.S. was giving away supplies to the Allied powers rather than making a profit. So Roosevelt was ultimately successful in gaining support for his policy by giving the simple example of a house being on fire. So he says, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't want to sell them a water hose, you want to give it to them. Then you take the hose back once the fire is out. This helps your neighbor Number one, and it makes sure that the fire doesn't spread to your own house. So he is saying that Europe is in this war right now, and they need our help. We're not going to always charge them. And once the war is over, then we can get what they owe us. If we help Europe and the allied powers, the allied countries, to make sure that they take care of this war, then it will not come over and spread to the U.S. So this helped him get support for this program. And it also helped Great Britain be successful in defending against the German invasion. So in the next section of your handout, you have several questions that you have to answer. So question 4 says, how much money was given in aid through the Lend-Lease Act? The answer to that is $11.1 billion. You then had to provide the definition of opposition, which means against the war. Question number 6 says, what were 2 reasons some opposed the U.S. involvement in the Lend-Lease Act? The first reason was they worried that the result of this would be the U.S. being dragged into the war. And then the second reason some were opposed to the U.S. involvement in the Lend-Lease Act was that Americans felt that the United States was often given supplies rather than making a profit. So once you get those 3 questions answered, I want you to look at number 7. It says, do you think FDR's explanation of a neighbor's burning house justified the country's involvement in the Lend-Lease program? Explain your answer. So I want you to provide a short written response of at least 5 sentences explaining, does his explanation justify the U.S. becoming involved in the Lend-Lease program? So think about how the U.S. benefits from sending supplies to the Allied powers. Think about what would happen if the U.S. did not participate in the Lend-Lease Act. Because remember, England came to FDR and let him know that they were going to soon be bankrupt. So think about what would have happened if they indeed became bankrupt and could not afford to continue fighting in the war. So I want you to write at least a 5-sentence response to that question. You are going to make sure that your first and last name is on your handout. You are going to turn that in when you are done. And we will go over those when I return. So all is going well for the United States until December 7th, 1941. So FDR called December 7th, 1941 a day that will live in infamy because on that day, Japanese planes launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Hundreds of Japanese planes bombed U.S. ships as they sat anchored in the harbor, killing and wounding thousands of U.S. soldiers and citizens. The very next day, FDR went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Japan. Congress agreed with his request. A short time later, Germany and Italy honored a pact they had with Japan and declared war on the U.S. After years of successfully avoiding the war, the U.S. now found itself thrust into the middle of the greatest military conflict in history. So here are some images of the damage that was done to Pearl Harbor. So there were 2,402 Americans killed, 1,282 Americans injured. There were 188 U.S. aircraft destroyed. 8 U.S. battleships were damaged, 4 U.S. battleships were sunk, and 6 eventually returned to service. So this is what Pearl Harbor looks like today. So here are some images. You can see this is the USS Arizona Memorial. So what you're going to do now, you are going to open up your Chromebooks. You're going to sign into Google Classroom. So open up your interactive notebook to slide 9, and you're going to complete the slide that says U.S. enters World War II. You have 2 boxes that you have to complete. The first box is the Lend-Lease Act. You are simply going to tell what the U.S. Sold and what they received in return, and then give a brief description of Pearl Harbor. So your notes should look similar to what is depicted on this slide. Once you have completed that, you can complete the Lend-Lease Act Ed puzzle located in Google Classroom. If you cannot complete it, don't worry about it. I know many of you have already completed it. I'm not sure if the filter will allow you to complete it or not, so if you cannot, don't worry about it. For my 5th period class, I've already added you guys to a new Google Classroom. You're just going to go in, click join, and the interactive notebook should be there. Just go ahead and start on slide 9. When I return on Thursday, I will show you how to add your previous notebook so that you do not have to start from scratch. So if you have all of these things completed, you have accomplished our task for today. I want you guys to make sure that you complete your short response on the handout. Make sure your first and last name is on it. Make sure you get that turned in. Complete your interactive notebook slide. Once you've completed the interactive notebook slide, you're going to complete the Lend-Lease Act Ed puzzle assignment. And once you complete those things, have a fabulous rest of your day.